Okay, I'm not really going to argue the reasoning of God in existence or anything. I just want to kind of point out something to everyone here. Um, One of the great flaws with atheism is it can never seem to explain how the universe came into existence. Um, Now, God supposedly in the Bible created the universe, so reasonably within this, I can conclude that logic does form within God, and He has created us with some sense of logic or reasoning. And while our reasoning may not be the same at all times, that is only because we are not always within God's logic. We do not always do right, so obviously we don't always do right in God's eyes, so therefore obviously we are not always logically correct in God's eyes. So therefore we can make reasoning errors which do not seem apparent. Now, I'm going to kind of explain this a little bit. The errors in reasoning and logic are very obvious once you exclude everything else and use reasoning alone as a lifestyle or a choice without using any other kind of consideration at all but logic and reasoning, then obviously there is fallacy in that as well. Um, Now, you're saying, well, that's obvious. Yes, it is obvious, but the same thing is true with faith. The same thing is true with knowledge. All three are really kind of big deals to me. It makes sense logically um, that the three work together, and in working together, they do not have to be totally reconciled. They are each separate entities that have separate designs and capabilities. For instance, you cannot use faith and reason at the same exact time because reason cannot include emotions. You cannot reason with emotion. Um, those are natural instincts. Now, faith can use emotions to know in something that you don't necessarily know. Like, for instance, if I've heard that an apple is red, but I don't know that apples are necessarily red, and I've seen a green one, but I know that they're red, I haven't seen any pictures or anything, that is faith. And faith is like a risk, kind of. You can use faith to base reasoning off of. Faith is kind of like a connecting link between reason or logic and actual human emotion. So therefore, I can say, I don't know that, Winston Churchill existed. I mean, I've seen pictures that are supposedly of him. I've seen videos that are supposedly of him, but I don't know that he existed. I don't know that Hitler existed because I never saw them. I don't know. I can conceptualize that they existed, yes. But in such a conception, I am having faith. That is what faith is, believing in things that you don't necessarily know for a fact. So therefore, in having faith, having a conception in my mind, I can therefore base my logic off my conceptions. That is why human logic is not necessarily divine in origin. Obviously, divine logic is the basis for all human logic, as God created logic as well as everything else in the universe, in my belief. That is my personal opinion. You may disagree, I don't mind. But the basis of that means that my conception of God is my conception of God. That does not mean it's a valid conception. Now, I'm using reasoning to, in fact, validate, it can, make a valid conception of God within logic, reason, and knowledge. I don't actually know that he existed. I do know that some things do exist. We know that the Big Bang happened, so in using faith and that knowledge that we know that the Big Bang happened, I can therefore reason that God caused the Big Bang, seeing how as there is no better explanation for it. That is how I use reasoning, faith and knowledge together to, make valid arguments. It makes perfect sense. Now, I want to kind of point out something else. I know this is about logic and reason, but I have found this to be a huge flaw. Just right under your nose, the elephant in the room. Um, it's a literary theory called semantic autonomy. Now, what it is you evaluate a text, and you totally exclude what the author may have meant by the text. You exclude the thoughts, actions, feelings, all of that because you're using reason only. So, in only using reason to evaluate a text, you are in fact um, using semantic autonomy. Now, when you exclude the author, you may warp the text into an interpretation which is not entirely accurate, meaning that it is not valid. That is why there's so many denominations of Christians in the world now. That's why Islam, Judaism, and Christianity exist as separate entities. They believe in the same God. They have different conceptions about that God, based on different interpretations or, conceptions of the written text on God. Now, knowing all of this, if I read all of the religious texts having to do with that one God, and therefore knowing God's character through Jesus, who was God in the flesh, based on my faith, I don't know that that was true, but I don't know that Winston Churchill exists. I don't know that the video response this is made to, the guy in that video exists. I don't know. Unless I actually physically see the guy, I can only conceptualize. And even then, I can still only conceptualize that he existed. The knowledge that he was actually there gives me the faith for me to use reason based on my conceptions of him existing. Now, this, makes obvious huge gaps in the atheist reasoning that God may not exist. Well, first of all, you're totally excluding faith, and in excluding faith, or denying faith, as some do, you are, in fact, denying your own conceptions. Now, how can you reason off of unknown conceptions? Like, how can you just generalize something like that? It makes no logical sense at all without a valid interpretation. And there is no valid interpretation unless you understand the author, and in rejecting the author, you do not understand him. You are rejecting him, so therefore, all of the conceptions that atheists have about God are false, fallacy. Now, if you do in fact understand God, but then reject him, that would make sense. That would make perfect sense, but I've never seen that happen, really. I mean, anyone that truly knows God would never reject him because he stands for love. And as me personally knowing God, or Jesus, I can obviously conceptualize my own reasoning. That makes perfect sense, but in not really accepting something, how can you understand something you've rejected in order to reason that it does not exist? That is what makes no sense to me. That is one flaw in reasoning. You separate it from faith. You separate it from the conceptions that you may have based on personal experience. Personal experience is what is used to gain scientific knowledge. It is what is used to gain any kind of knowledge at all. The scientific process, I must hypothesize something that I do not necessarily know for a fact. I must say, I think that if I drop that apple, it's going to fall, based on the theory of gravity. I don't know that it's going to fall, but I can have faith, have a conception that it will. Now, I drop the apple and it falls, and my faith has been rewarded. It does not always happen, but it does happen sometimes. That is how knowledge is found. So in denying faith and God, you are denying the scientific process in its essence. So therefore, how could you ever have true knowledge? Now, this is all kind of like a theory to me at this point. I just pretty much came up with it when I saw this video, so it's obviously going to have flaws. But what I am saying is that reason has far more flaws by itself than reason, faith, and knowledge together have. Hitler, although he said he was Christian, was not, in fact, Christian. He may have written about it many times, but he rejected God's word. He he banished the Old Testament in the Bible. He burned the Old Testament. So therefore, you are banishing part of the basis of what God is. So therefore, you do not entirely know what God is. Now, saying that means that he is not entirely a Christian already. But then he claims that Jesus was not Jewish because he hated the Jewish people. So that is another entire rejection. So, in rejecting faith and his conceptions of God, or the common conceptions of God, for his own, he has in fact rejected Christianity, so therefore he is not a Christian. Now, saying this, I can also tell you that he used reasoning and knowledge to in fact evaluate that scientifically Jewish people were not, in fact, worth living. He evaluated them scientifically using methods, scientific process, but without that faith, he really could say whatever he wanted to, because he did not accept or assume anything as an actual logical point or fact, which is what faith is. In denying faith, he says, well, the Jewish population, their heads are smaller on average, so therefore they must not be good. They must not be as superior as we are. We have bigger heads. That's the line of reasoning he would follow. He would use all kinds of reasoning like that. They have big noses, so they're ugly, so therefore they are bad. All kinds of things of that nature to reason that Jewish people should be killed. And he succeeded, mainly because propaganda, but the German population were all Christians, so they should have understood at least that God does exist, and in existing, he is love. It says God is love in the Bible, actually in the New Testament. So in saying that, they should understand that seeing how as God is love, even if the line of reasoning were that Jewish people were inferior and the knowledge behind it, scientific evidence, suggested that, they would tolerate it based on, faith in God being love, and in such love tolerating people inferior, like invalids, crippled people. So therefore, in tolerating that, the Holocaust never would have happened. But in banishing faith, it was allowed to happen, because there was no basis to, in fact, assume that the Jewish people were worth living. Hitler did the same thing to gay people. I believe that is also wrong. Gay people, or homosexual people, pretty much anyone, is within the realm of God's love, and so therefore, I can obviously safely conclude that it is within the realm of my love. Now, I'm not saying I'm homosexual, but I am saying that I'm not going to reject homosexuality based on those principles. Now, I lost my train of thought, but this obviously points out some of the flaws of reason. And in pointing out some of the flaws of reason, perhaps I can clear it up that faith is not necessarily just a random radical belief in something you don't know. It is in fact used every day in the economy, in the public sector, in the military. In every single walk of life, faith is used. It may not be used correctly, but it is used. And so therefore, faith being a separate entity from reason, you cannot use reason to prove faith's existence or non-existence. They work together. And in not working together, both are false. Not one or the other. Because faith is going to exist regardless, and reason is going to exist regardless. These are obviously accepted principles. So, in knowing such, you cannot conclude within reason, without using faith, that, God is false without understanding God's meaning. So therefore, every interpretation, in conclusion, every interpretation of God is pretty much not entirely accurate. That's all I wanted to talk about, and perhaps I've cleared up a bunch of things for people. I do not mean any intolerance by this, and I am simply doing this to enlighten people.